Are you tired of feeling chained by your finances? Do you worry and debt feel like heavy shackles holding you back from the abundant life God intends? Well, today on the show, my special guest Craig and I are going all in. We're going to be talking about breaking free, reclaiming control, and unlocking true financial freedom through faith-based perspectives and principles. Are you ready to break the chains? If you are, then let's get started.
In a world where crushing debt keeps you trapped, where living paycheck to paycheck has become your new normal, and where the dream of retirement seems impossibly out of reach, there's hope. Join financial evangelist Ralph E. Stepp Jr., a man who's walked through the fire of financial failure and emerged stronger on the other side. Welcome to Ask Ralph, the show where real-world experience meets biblical truth to break the bondage of financial despair. Get ready to take control of your money, break free from the financial stress, and align your resources with God's purpose for your life. This is Ask Ralph with Ralph E. Stepp Jr.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Ralph, and I'm thrilled to have my friend and guest host, Craig, joining me again today. Craig, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Oh, you're very welcome. We just asked, a really difficult question. Are you ready to break free from financial shackles? And Craig, that phrase, financial shackles, what comes to your mind when you think about that?
Well, shackles restrict freedom. And that's really what those kinds of financial challenges can do, is they restrict your freedom. And that's a huge thing. I've never had handcuffs on. I don't ever want to. But I can't imagine not being able to move your arms. What kind of panic, and so finances can do the same thing.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be talking about some key strategies such as budgeting, controlling impulse spending, but more importantly, we're going to discuss how these are tools for Christians seeking that financial freedom to actually remove those shackles. It's what we call budgeting is a secret weapon. And I talk about it on the show all the time. We talked about kicking impulsive spending. And today we're going to dig a little deeper into the why and the how, because a lot of times, Craig, I think it's really about the why and the how that makes this so fundamentally important, and how these things can help you break free of those chains, especially if you feel stuck paycheck to paycheck. So this is live, and if you're watching the show right now, we want you to participate. You can use the chat. You can share your thoughts. You can ask questions. Let's make this a community discussion. So, Craig, let's jump into it.
All right. Sounds good.
So thinking about financial freedom, what's the absolute first step someone needs to take? In my opinion, I started with this topic earlier this week, and I believe that budgeting is really the secret weapon. Craig, why do you think that is such strong language? Is that really that powerful to have that budget?
It is. I mean, how do you know how to fix things if you don't know where your money's going? So even if you don't, and I want to hear your opinion on this, Ralph, even if you don't get to the budget part, I'm going to take this much money and put it towards this, and this much money and put it towards that. If all you did was just record where your money went, you'd be a lot better off. And you have to do that really before you can do a competent budget, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I make the analogy that a budget is sort of like a blueprint for your financial house. You're not going to build a house if you don't have a basic understanding of what that's going to look like. And it really is that simple. But when I look at people that I talk to every day, Craig, it sounds simple, but how many people are building without having that plan? And honestly, if you're listening right now, or if you're watching, do you have a financial blueprint? So let's start breaking down the core ideas in that, because really the whole point of this, and this is what we talk about freedom, is making money last. And it all comes down to intentionality. And that really is what we talk about when we talk about budgeting. So many times people feel like budgeting is a restriction. Craig, do you feel that way too? Like budgeting is sort of a restrictive type of word?
Well, it is, but in a good way. You are trying to restrict your mental space. I'm not saying that very well, but just because you have a budget doesn't mean you can't blow money. But it does kind of put your spending, it's either inside this budget or it's outside this budget. And so in that way, I don't think it really constrains you, because you get to decide what goes in the budget and out of the budget. So it kind of does in the moment, but longer term, I don't think it really does constrain you.
No, actually, and I think what you're really keying into, Craig, is intentionality. And as you can be intentional and choose to spend wherever you want to spend it. I mean, it's not for you or for me to say to somebody, hey, you need to spend your money on this. Now, but the difference is being intentional about it. And Craig, you brought up the first thing I wanted to talk about today, and that is that crucial first step, and that's tracking. Because like you said, if you don't know where your income is going, where your expenses is going, you're never going to figure it out. And Craig, why do you think that's such an overlooked thing, and why do you think it's so eye-opening when people do it? Because I think people are actually uncomfortable, and what does it reveal? Have you ever done this, and what was your experience?
Yeah, I have. Not recently, but I think people are afraid of what it's going to show. It's kind of the same thing. You and I have talked about this several times. It's kind of like when you're trying to drop some weight. You start writing down everything you eat, and it's like, oh my, I have got to make some changes. But you've got to take that first step. And if you don't do that, you're just dead in the water. But I think it is uncomfortable. People don't really want to know some of this stuff.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But I think you're also right that it's the intentionality of that you have to do that. Because if you don't, picture this, you're in a boat and you're going out on the pond. I know you've got a pond. You posted a picture on Facebook about your pond. And I told a funny story when I saw yours about how one day I bought this boat. And we got like a 1 acre pond here on the farm. And I got in this boat, and it's a little paddle boat. And here I am, fat man in a little boat, right? And I'm thinking, oh, this thing's great. Well, all of a sudden I get about halfway across. We had a little island in the middle. And I got about halfway across, Craig, and I looked down, and there's water coming in the boat. And I'm thinking, where is this water coming from? Now, in my particular case, it was because I was so heavy, the back of the boat was pitched down at the bottom. But it works the same way with a budget. If you don't know where the leaks are, if you don't know where the money's going, that's going to put shackles on you because you can't make better decisions. And that's why it ultimately leads to freedom. And Craig, when you've done that before, when you've looked at your spending, what was that one category that always sort of surprised you? I know you mentioned last week eating out was one that was kind of surprising to you. But what other things kind of surprised you when you did that?
That and just these unnecessary nickel and dime expenses. This is something that shocks me every month. I scan through our credit card bills, and we'll get some pretty good sized credit card bill. And the vast majority of the charges are less than $100. It's $10 here and $20 there and $40 another place. But no one of those is going to really put you underwater, but 40 or 50 of them will. And so you start those little things. You think going out to lunch. I know you don't go out to lunch. I don't either anymore, but I used to go out every day.
Sure.
Well, even back when it was $10 a day, that's a lot of money. And it's just really hard to recognize that unless you start trying to track it, because it's this under the radar spending. The big things are easy. And I don't mean easy to pay. Sorry, I should say that differently. The big things are easy to track, but they're really hard to, I'm not saying this very well. I've been up since 2 this morning. So,
oh boy, you've had a, no, but
yeah.
What you're trying to say is the big things are easy to see, and they're easy to see. Oh, there it is. They're easy to identify. I think what you're getting at, Craig, is they're not easy to change. Whereas the little things are so easy to miss because they're $10 here. And I mean to interrupt you, but I think that's where you were going.
No, that's exactly where I was going, and thank you for bailing me out.
Oh, it's no problem, my friend.
But those little things are where a lot of the control is. I think this is a key point. You got to pay your rent. You got to pay your utilities. You may have a car payment. There are certain things that you just flat have to pay, or you're in deep trouble. So you kind of can't, you can a little bit, but the real control is in all that discretionary spending, which often is in little drips and drabs.
Oh, absolutely right. I agree with that. My son was over this weekend, and he was telling me, he said to me, Dad, he says, what do you think I should do? Should I focus on paying off my credit card, or should I focus on building my emergency fund? And I said, really, you got to do both. And I think that's where tracking your income and expenses is so important, because if you're going to eventually get to that point where you create that budget or that intentional spending plan, you got to really know what's going on from the beginning. And like you said, I think you've got to start by listing your income sources. It's really pretty simple. A budget is not rocket science. I think a lot of people hear that and they go, oh boy, what is Ralph talking about? What is Craig talking about, this budget? don't overthink it. It's really start off with your income. And then, like Craig said, list those fixed costs. Those are the things you have to pay. If you want to have a roof over your head, you're either going to pay a mortgage or you're going to pay rent. That's kind of a given. You need to have electric. You need to have water, sewer, whatever that looks like for you. And then you get into those variable costs. But a very simple budget is not that complicated. Just a matter of laying out and one of the best things you can do is, like you said, Craig, you start off with the end in mind. You start tracking those expenses. And then you could start to see, okay, well, here's what my rent is every month. Probably most people know that. But I don't think a lot of people get into the detail knowing, well, hey, I just spent $300 eating out last month. Or I just spent $174 on subscriptions. And then once you do that, then you can be more intentional. You can allocate those funds to different places. And one of the things that I said to my son is, I think you got to allocate some of it to savings. I about blew him away when I said to him, I think you should be putting 20% of your monthly income into savings. He's like, Dad, how do I do that? But I said to him, that's part of it. And I think giving is part of it too. And I think, Craig, I wanted to ask you a question, I'm not trying to pry, but I think giving has to be deliberate as part of this as well, because one of the things I talked about on the show this past week is that, in my view, giving is actually a tool that leads you to being more successful in your finances. What is your thought on that, Craig?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. By the way, I felt a little attacked with that subscription crack, thinking about how many I pay.
Are those mostly AI subscriptions, or are they just subscriptions in general?
Mostly AI.
Well,
So I have a problem. I know.
Yeah, but you also have a podcast that's all about AI, Craig. So that's not an unreasonable expense.
That's right. I don't really drink. I don't play golf, so it's okay. Well, the giving is an interesting thing, and I know you are not of this mindset, but I really caution against this whole abundance giving, whatever that, you give so you'll get more back from God.
Oh yeah, you're talking about the prosperity preachers. They drive me crazy. Craig, I speak about that on the show all the time. There are these knuckleheads, and I'll use the word knuckle. I'm not afraid to say it. I might get some hate message. That's fine with me. Maybe I'll go viral because of it. God is not asking you. God does not promise you, hey, if you send me $1,000, I'm going to multiply that 10 times. That is complete nonsense. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Craig, but don't let me interrupt your thought there.
No, so you give because it's a signal of what's important to you. And that's it. You give because giving is important. And that's enough of a return. And I know there, the 10% and exactly what talents means in the Bible and that sort of thing is all a little bit muddled and confusing. But if you don't have giving in your budget, then it isn't really a priority. If you're not giving and you're spending money on other things that are discretionary, you're making a choice not to give. And if that's your choice, that's fine.
Right.
But recognize it's a choice.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I hear people say all the time. They're like, Ralph, how am I supposed to give when my finances are so tight? Well, and I'm going to challenge everybody. Here's a Christian-based show. Maybe that's the problem, is that your finances are so tight because you're not giving. And I've had many people say to me, Craig, and it's happened in my own life. And again, this is one of those philosophical religious discussions that people could disagree with. And like I said, I'm not all about the prosperity side of this. But I have had many clients say to me, Ralph, you challenged me. And they always say, you challenged me at taxes. You always ask me what my charitable giving was. And you always I'm always wondering, what should I tell Ralph? Did I really do it this year? I said, no, that's your choice. The Bible talks about being a cheerful giver. If you're going to be reluctant in doing it, then don't do it. And a lot of pastors might be listening to this right now and say, oh, Ralph is preaching against tithing. That's not what I said. But the Bible is very clear about being a cheerful giver. Well, I think that's all about your mindset. And if you have a mindset that giving is part of that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time parked here, but if you have that mindset, my position is that it is a mind shift change for everything. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think that's so very important. But let's get to the next thing I want to talk about, Craig. And that is the biggest mental roadblocks that people face when budgeting. I hear all the time, it's too complicated. I don't even have enough money to start budgeting. And it just feels restricting to me. Craig, in your experience, what have you found to be the biggest mental roadblocks to people actually, first of all, doing the budget, but then actually doing something about the budget? It's great to write it, But if you're not implementing, if you're not measuring it, what's the point?
Well, I think there are several things, a couple of which we've talked about already. The overcomplicating. I mean, people think about maybe budgeting activities they've been involved with at work or, whatever, where you've got all these different departments in it. No, that's not what you're doing. And so they're way overcomplicated. As I said earlier, I think it's scary for people. There's a piece of us that just doesn't want to know some of that. The other thing is that it's discipline. A lot of what keeps us from doing well in our lives is a lack of discipline. And I don't mean you have to be, like a Marine sergeant or anything like that, but you have to not pick up that candy bar in the checkout line. You have to not, stop for a latte every day, or maybe eat breakfast before you go into work, or whatever it might be. But that takes a little bit of discipline. And if we haven't been disciplined, it can be pretty tough to start to be disciplined, whether you're talking about financially, health-wise, whatever it is. It's hard. If you first start working out, if you first start trying to, get better sleep, spend your money more wisely, whatever it is, it's hard to get started. But once you get started, there's kind of a dopamine feedback loop where I didn't go out to lunch every day this week. And that feels kind of good. And I've got an extra $40 now because of that. And I see my little savings account grow, or I see my credit card debt going down just a little bit. And that really does have this feedback loop where that's a good thing. I want to do more of that. But you got to get started. If you don't get started, you can't get there.
It's absolutely true. I do a Monday mastermind group with some other Christian men who are podcasters. And we had this long discussion yesterday. One of the men in our group has a natural health type of show that he's working through. And we had this long discussion about, do people actually know what they're supposed to do, or do people not know? And I'm going to kind of equate that to what we're talking about here. I think at some level, most people get, hey, if I'm bringing in this much money, I can only spend this much money. That's not complicated. You don't have to be, a rocket scientist. I use that term a couple of times, but you don't have to be a PhD in business to understand that what comes in, you can't spend more than that unless you go into debt.
Right.
And we had this big philosophical discussion yesterday of, do we talk to people about, the why, or do we talk to them about the action step, the pain point? And that's what I want to land here for a minute, because one of the ways that I think we can reframe this, and I think it's so important to reframe it, because I think the word budgeting, it sounds like restricted, because like you said, people are accustomed, it's time to do the budgets. That means somebody's losing money, or somebody's going to have to spend less. But then it looks like chains, right? It's like we're putting chains on that. We're putting this, chains around that, right? But when you look at it as a tool, and when you look at it as a tool for freedom, I think that's the way you have to look at that. Because like you said, once you start to live in this reality of a budget, we're not going to spend a lot more time talking about budgets today, but once you start living in that reality of the budget, ultimately you have freedom. Because then all of a sudden you're not trying to figure out, the old adage, rob Peter to pay Paul. Well, because you've got margin. And that's the thing. Like, I don't think sometimes people see that light at the end of the tunnel. They see it as this huge restriction. And my son's this way. He kind of said this to me. He's like, Dad, oh yeah, you always talking about, you want me to get on a budget. I said, yeah. He said, you want to restrict me? I said, no, actually the opposite. I want you to have freedom. I want you to be able to say, I choose to spend money on going out to Buffalo Wild Wings to eat. Or I choose to buy the latest tech gadget. Or as Craig does, I choose to buy every single AI app that's available. I'm just picking on you, Craig. But you understand what I'm saying is because ultimately that's freedom. And then you're directing those dollars. You're basically saying to the dollar, here's your job, go do it. That's ultimately control. But the opposite of that, we think we're in control by not having a budget. We're actually out of control with not having a budget.
That's right. Well, and you've talked about this a number of times, intentionality. Even if you don't want to sit down and come up with a strict budget, if you just get more intentional about your spending, you're going to be better off. So if budgeting is, I want to know what you think about this. If budgeting is too much, okay, don't call it a budget. Just write down where you want your money to go. Just write down where you want your money to go. And then think of that. Think of that document before you go out and spend money. I mean, so many, Ralph, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here,
Oh,
but
go ahead. You're welcome to.
so many people live their lives on autopilot. They just drift around, get blown around with the wind. Even autopilot is too strong. They're out there on a boat in a big lake, not my pond, getting blown around by the wind and the tide. And that is no way to live a good life. And if you can break that cycle, even if it's just with your spending, you're going to find you have a much more fulfilled life that's more rewarding, because now you're in control of it. You have the freedom to make those choices instead of just, oh, where's the wind going to blow out of today? And okay, I'm going to go in that direction. And that's just no way to live. And if you don't at least have some intentionality about how you spend, then you're getting blown around by whatever the prevailing wind is, and that's not a good way to live.
Absolutely. And it's funny. I think a great analogy is, I remember when you were a kid, like, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, we got our Christmas wish list, right? And our parents would say, hey, what do you want for Christmas? Well, that was a very positive experience, wasn't it, Craig? Because I remember as a kid, like, we'd get the Sears catalog out, and it would always have the latest toys. And I'm dating myself now because people are listening, like, what is a Sears catalog? But we would get that out because all the newest toys were in there and the gadgets and all the cool stuff. And we'd make this list, and that would be that Christmas wish list. Well, if you start to frame your budget the same way, it does the same thing. Because then you're putting out, here's my wishes. Here's the thing I want to see happen. And ultimately, unlike that Christmas wish list where you didn't have any control, like, here you go, here's grandparents, here's what we'd like to have, or parents, here's what I'd like to have. Your budget wish list, you have complete control over.
Right.
Because you can make those decisions.
It was a little trivia. I think they called the Sears catalog the Wish Book, the one that came out.
I'm pretty sure that's what it was called.
Yeah. So, yeah, I spent a lot of time with that as a kid and got virtually nothing of what I put on my list because it was so expensive.
Well, we always dream big, right? I mean, that was the thing. You dream big, and you could do the same thing with a budget.
Well, I was going to bring that up because you may have some big things that you want. And if you put that in your budget, okay, I'm going to put away this much money towards that vacation or that new truck or that, boat that doesn't leak or whatever it is, you can start working towards it. And I'll go back to that little dopamine hit. Making progress feels good. Being out of control, I mean, there's good empirical evidence to tell us that feels bad. That's really bad for our well-being.
Well, that's absolutely true. Well, let's change the subject a little bit. Let's move away from it. So we've already documented, I think, that the blueprint equals a budget. Well, now I'm going to throw something out of left field. Well, impulse spending, that's the wrecking ball. And Craig, why is it so common, even with good intentions, that people just spend it, with that impulse? What do you think is the trigger there?
Well, the decks are stacked against us there. So I can think of at least 3 industries that are directed at pushing us towards impulse buying. So there's marketing, there's advertising, which is not exactly the same thing, and then product merchandising. There's a reason that the candy bars are right there in the checkout line. There's a reason they're there because, I'm spending, these days I'm spending $250 on groceries for the day.
If you're lucky. We went to the grocery store this week and my wife says, Ralph, you don't realize how much stuff costs.
No, it's a shock every time I do the shopping. But okay, you're spending a couple $100. Yeah, I'm a little bit hungry. Let me get that, Three Musketeers bar or whatever that's only $2.50. I'm not even going to notice it. And it's right there. If you had to turn around and go back to the candy bar aisle, like, I'll live without it. But the deck is really stacked against us when it comes to impulse buying, so we have to be strong.
Yeah, and the truth is, Craig, it keeps people trapped in that paycheck to paycheck cycle because they don't get any margin. It undermines your freedom. And it steals your peace. I was listening to your show this morning, your Live Well and Flourish show, and you talked all about mental health and all this kind of stuff. And you mentioned how people don't live in peace. Well, if you're constantly being bombarded with this impulse spending, you're not going to find any peace. And you know what's funny? I was out this weekend. We went out. It's the first kind of breath I've had since tax season's actually over today. But I kind of give myself a little margin here at the end. So we actually went shopping on, I think it was Saturday, and I hadn't really gotten out much. I was sort of locked down here in the Attila the Hun tax chair for the last 3 months. But I got out to shop, and it occurred to me, I'm walking through the store, and it is impulse, like it's sensitivity overload. And the whole goal is for you to walk out that door penniless. And here's the thing, and this is going to, and then the bank people are listening, they're bringing this, oh boy, Ralph has lost his mind. But your credit cards make it so easy. And what does the credit card do? It leaves you in a perpetual state of complete disaster. Because you get these impulses thrown at you. Look, I got on this morning, popped up my email, and I had to have 10 emails of people trying to sell me shirts and slacks and electronic gadgets and AI, and I'm just being funny, and subscriptions to different things. But Craig, we're constantly bombarded with that. And guess what that's doing? It's undermining our freedom, it's undermining our peace, and it's a wrecking ball to our finances. So we got to talk about some solutions, but go ahead. You had a thought there.
Well, one of the things that keeps me from doing impulse buying, and I'm going to cuss just a little bit, it pisses me off when somebody tries to manipulate me.
Oh, I hear that.
I don't like being manipulated. And when you think about it through that perspective, is all of that stuff is intended to manipulate you. And it kind of gets my back up. It's like, nope, I'm not going to do this. Now, I won't say I'm 100% or even 90% on that. But I think that little bit of a mindset shift can be valuable if it's just like, wait a second, somebody's trying to push me into this. And I want to mention one other thing before we move on. I want to go back to the candy bar because it's right around lunchtime here. How many times have you grabbed one of those candy bars, wolfed it down, walking out to your vehicle, and then thought, oh man, I'm really so glad I made the decision to buy and eat that candy bar. I mean, maybe you need some, your blood sugar's a little down or something like that. So maybe, but it's pretty rare. Usually it's the exact opposite. It's like, oh man, I shouldn't have had that candy bar. And there we are. Most impulse buys are like that. You rarely go, oh, I am so glad that I bought that. It's pretty rare.
Craig, that is the perfect transition to what I want to talk about next. And that is identifying triggers, because I think that's where we have to go next. And we have to recognize why and when we spend impulsively. I think there's stress, there's boredom, there's social media. And I think, like you said, I mean, you're walking out the checkout aisle and there's those candy bars. And what triggers do you see, Craig? And how does awareness help those things?
Well, I think boredom, you hit on boredom, is a big one. There's this saying, retail therapy. Let's go shopping and go buy stuff because that's going to make me feel better. And it does for about that long. And then you feel not so good when you get that 27% credit card bill in the mail. And I think that's really a tough question. So what are those triggers? Because it's going to vary for everybody. But I think being a little bit more mindful can be helpful. So just every time you're ready to buy something, just make it a point to stop for 10 or 15 seconds and say, do I really want to buy this? And over time, you'll build a habit of that. It might take a week, it might take a month, but over time, you'll build a habit of doing that because your triggers are different than my triggers. And so, I mean, my triggers are, I like cool stuff. I don't have as many microphones as some people, but I do have more microphones than I have places to use microphones. And so, it's some little thing like that. And so you have to recognize where maybe you go a little bit too far. Here's one way to do it. Look around at all the stuff you haven't used in the last month. That could be a good pointer to maybe that's something is triggering that sort of a purchase. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. And I talked about on the show this past week what I called the power pause. And I think you have to implement that. And when you're walking through the store or when you're online shopping and it's not a need, it's definitely not a need. You're not, like you said, if your blood sugar is low, you need to eat something. That's a need. But if it's a want, I say, hey, call it the Ralph power pause. Call it whatever you want. But automatically say, nope, this is the time to pause. If it's a non-essential, if it's a want, put on the power pause. And then the other thing I'm going to challenge people as Christians to do is pray about it and say, God, hey, and think about that awareness. Like, God, why am I so directed to this? Because I'm like you, Craig, I love the new technology stuff. And I think in a lot of ways, it's an escape for me because I've got all this stress and I'm not trying, listen, I've been a blessed guy. I'm not complaining about the stress around me, but this time of year, tax season, like, I'm inundated. Like every hour I'm seeing a new person, which again, I'm not complaining about. It pays my bills and it pays them very well, but it's an escape, right? And it's that, let me go look and see what the newest things on Sweetwater are. Let's go see what Amazon has, the cool tech gadgets, or, Apple's releasing something new, or there's some new, app, that like that. But I think a lot of times it's an escape. And I think we have to really say to ourselves, okay, Ralph, first of all, let's be aware. Why are we feeling this way? What is it that's triggering this? Are we disappointed? Are we sad? Are we feeling, you brought it up. I talked about it on the show this past week, that whole idea of retail therapy. Well, here's the problem. And it's going to sound kind of bold, but it's like the alcoholic that goes to the bar looking for a solution to his drinking problem or her drinking problem. It's the same thing with impulse buying and retail therapy. If you're already having financial problems, adding more debt to your situation isn't going to help you.
No,
it's that short-term benefit, but it's not going to help you in the long run. It actually makes things worse.
It does. And you need more and more and more. So, you're going to need to spend more to get that little boost to your mood. But it's, I don't want us to make it sound like it's really easy to break these habits, but people can break these habits. Absolutely. I'm sure you have lots of examples of people you've worked with that, used to do these things that were not so good for their financial health. And now they've been able to break those habits and they're in a much better place.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we talk about some things that you can do. And that's what I want to take a few minutes and talk about. A lot of people, my grandparents used to do this thing called the envelope system. And I remember when I started doing my show again, I didn't really think about it. And then I was doing some research for a show and they started talking about these envelopes. And I'm thinking, man, I remember this from somewhere. And it was my mom's parents and my grandfather on that side. He was an Italian guy. He was one generation here from Italy, and he was what they call a tin banger. He was a sheet metal person that worked and that kind of stuff, and just kind of a everyday like worker bee, blue collar guy. And my grandmother, sort of the same thing, but they had these envelopes. And as a kid, I never understood what she was talking about. They'd sit because we go down and visit with them for the summer. They lived at the beach, not far from us. Once they both retired, and I remember we were down there for like a 2-week stint one time. And I guess it was the beginning of the month. So my grandmother had all these envelopes set out on the table. And I remember as a little kid, I was like 8 or 9 years old. I'm like, cool, are we going to the arcade? Because she had money and she was putting it on top of this envelope. And her and my grandfather standing there looking real intent. And I'm thinking, what is going on? And I didn't even make the connection until just recently. And I finally realized what they were doing. And that was the envelope system. And you know what? I think in a lot of ways, we can go back to that. We've got all kinds of cool technology. We got, my grandmother used to call them newfangled apps, and those things are great. And if you can use those, fantastic. But I think in a lot of ways, maybe you don't carry your credit card with you. Maybe you only carry cash and you only carry that cash that is what we call disposable. If you've got, let's just say at the beginning of the week, you have that intentional thought that, okay, I'm going to give myself $20 this week for my discretionary spending. And you put that $20 bill in your pocket. First of all, I think you're going to be more careful how you spend it because that $20, I remember as a kid, like you didn't want to break that 20. You wanted to have that 20 at the end of the week. Now, for me, it was because we go to the skating rink on Saturday morning and I could get pizza and Pepsi and candy and all that kind of stuff. But I think if you start to spend that cash or use that cash envelope system, Craig, so what do you think about these old school methods? Do you think they're still relevant and do you think they're still effective today?
I think they are still relevant. I mean, there's got to be some digital equivalent to the envelope system, but the envelope system was brilliant for a number of ways. So first of all, putting the number on the outside of the envelope about how much you need to have in there, you have done a budget. That's literally a budget. But then if you start taking your cash and putting it in the most important envelope first, fill that envelope up before you go to the next most important envelope, you're not only budgeting, you're pulling some of that money out of circulation. And so once it goes into that rent envelope, you can't spend it on anything else, right? I mean, I suppose you could, but under the system, that's it. Now you've got your rent covered. And so one of the things it does that I don't think people appreciated is that it makes you prioritize. Because if you did it the way that I know of it being done, it really was this, the most important thing is rent. Groceries are next, utilities are next, car payments next, whatever it is. And you start filling up the most important one first, you have to understand what your priorities are before you can really do the system. So I think I don't know how you do it in a world where we don't use a lot of cash, but I think there's something there just in the whole process of the envelope system. I had a lot
Yeah,
of friends back in the day that used it, so it's effective.
yeah, I remember my grandfather, the same grandfather we're talking about, he loved to go to the racetrack. And he would have his envelope for the racetrack. And my grandmother, she would fund it for him. And he was like, oh, let me see what's in the envelope. And you're right. I mean, once the envelope was empty, guess what? There's no more racetrack time. And I know there are some apps now that kind of go, I don't know. I don't have those right in front of me, but there are some ways to do that, Craig. But I think what you're really getting at is that intentionality again. You're intentionally filling that envelope, the most important ones. And I remember at times, looking back at it now, like the entertainment envelope never got any money in it that week, because they had to pay a tax bill, or the electric bill was more than they thought it was going to be. And I think now we live in, my wife uses the term in this all the time, she's, this instant gratification generation. And I think that's part of the problem too, is none of us, and I'll speak for myself, if we want it, like I'm in a place, and I bet you're probably in the same place. If you really want something, you probably just go get it, right? Yeah. And the problem with doing that is we have the capacity to do that. It wasn't 30 years ago, it wasn't 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, Amazon didn't exist. Like the other day, I'm sitting in my office, it was yesterday. And we use 3-ring binders to put people's tax returns in if they still want a physical copy of it. And my secretary, she said, Ralph, we're out of binders. And I'm like, okay, let me get on Amazon. And Craig, I had those in 2 hours.
Yeah.
Well, before, I remember he went, okay, we got to plan a trip to the office store, and you're going to plan all that out ahead of time. But now this instant gratification position we're in, when we want something, we push a couple buttons and ding dong, here it is. And I think the problem with that is it doesn't give us those easier ways to, because it used to be, I remember as a kid, like I'd come home from school and somebody at school would have the coolest new shoes or something like that. And we come home and I remember my mom was a single mom raising me, and it would be around dinner time. I'm like, Mom, we got to go to the store tonight. And she's like, well, what's going on? I said, oh, my friend Louie, he's got those shoes. And they got them at the sporting goods store up on, I lived on Kirkwood Highway. And we got to go to Kirkwood Highway, Mom, we got to get those shoes. And, I was like, oh, Ralph, I'm tired, had a long day. But now, dude, like all I got to do is open up my iPhone and click shoes, done. They're there in an hour. Yeah. And that's the problem, is we don't have that ability as much as we did. We didn't have to physically get in the car. Now, my mom's always saying is, I'll get those for you the second Tuesday of next week. And I'm thinking, boy, she got me again.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, but everything you just said is true. But it's not an excuse. I mean, I can envision people saying, it's just so easy. Yeah, but you're still making a choice. In fact, multiple choices. You make a choice to put that thing in the shopping cart. You make the choice to actually buy that thing. So you're at least making 2 choices right there. You made a choice to even search, spend your time looking at that kind of thing. Now, your binders, you need your binders.
Right.
You got to buy those. But that new pair of shoes, a new watch, whatever it is, there are a lot of choices that go into that chain before it shows up at your door. And you get to decide each and every time, do I do this? So if you don't, like, I used to have a real watch problem. I love watches. Well, if I don't want to spend money on watches, don't shop for watches. Don't read the watch forums. Don't look at watch ads on YouTube. Just don't do that. And you never get into that chain. But let's say I slip a little bit and somebody's talking about this new cool watch that's out. Well, I still get to decide, do I go look and see how much that cost? Or do I put it in my shopping cart? Or do I actually order it? We get to make a choice at every one of those stages. And I think that this is a recurring theme, is we are adults with agency. And if you choose not to exercise that agency, that's really on you. That's not on anybody who's trying to manipulate you. You have the ability to resist that temptation. You just need to do it. I know that sounds a little harsh, but I think that's absolutely true. Don't give up your agency.
No, and I'm going to frame it a little differently because I agree with you 100%. I think you got to keep the big picture front and center. And that big picture is this constantly, weighing these scales of, is it debt or is it savings? And it really comes down to that, because we have to get in the point, because you're absolutely right. You ultimately have the choice. And we have to get into that place of saying no. And the thing is, Craig, you alluded to this earlier. It's those small little daily choices. It's the little nickel and dime things that lead to these bigger and bigger things. And that's what we're talking about here. It's not, like you said, it's not the big thing, well, I'm going to go buy a car today. Most people don't have the capacity to go write a check for a car. Now, some people do. That's great. But most people don't, right? But it's that $5, we're going to pick on lattes again. Or it's whatever that candy bar is, day in and day out. Like you mentioned last week on the show, I thought it was brilliant. You talked about, it's funny because I was washing the car and I was re-listening to our show, and I heard Craig come on and said, yeah, it's that, and it made me Jones for a donut, man. I haven't had a donut forever. But it's a decision, right? It's that decision. Do I get that coffee and donut every morning on the way to work? And you said $10. I don't know where you're shopping, dude, but it's probably about 15 now. But anyway, add that up over 30 days. That's $300 or $400. And then people say to me, well, Ralph, I can't save money. I can't build an emergency fund. I'm like, as you're smoking a cigarette, I'm not picking on people that smoke, but as you're doing that, or as you're going to, the Starbucks cups or whatever that is. But the problem is it's so hard, even, because those things are so small and they just add up and they add up. But I think if we look at things in the big picture and say, here's what that's going to look like, that decision, the counterpoint to that decision is then I don't have any savings. I don't have any emergency fund. I don't have any margin. I go into debt. I lose my freedom.
And as you can tell, I'm at the age where I'm really thinking a lot about how much freedom I'm going to have at retirement. And so, it's nice to be in a spot where, I could quit work. It'd be tight, but I could do it. I'm not going to be stuck in a job, and I'm not going to be stuck in a particular location. And, I'm not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but if I'd have stayed on the path I was in my 20s and early 30s, I'd be going, oh my God, how am I going to retire? And I've got friends in that situation where they're either having to keep working or they're, going to live a very meager lifestyle. And that's no way to be. We're making choices.
And that's the tragedy of the situation. I just read this morning, 68% of the U.S. population is living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? If you're living paycheck to paycheck with a paycheck, how do you think you're going to make out when you don't have one? Yeah. And I'm not trying to bring everybody down, but this is the time to change that. And I don't care whether you're 40, 50, 60, you can make a change today. Because listen, if you're struggling right now, hear me on this. If you're struggling right now, living paycheck to paycheck, and you still have a paycheck coming in, like Craig just said, what's that going to look like when you don't have that paycheck coming in? You ultimately are in control of your own freedom by making the decisions at age 20, at age 25. It's like when I have young people come in, they say to me, oh, Ralph, you're a little crazy like this. I'm like, no, start that 401k when you're on your first job. That's why I said to my son, he started doing barbering. And I said, son, do they have a 401k? Well, yeah, Dad, but I'm having a hard time paying my bills. I said, I don't care. Put money into your retirement now. He goes, Dad, I'm 23 years old. I'm not going to retire for 40 years. And I said, there is going to come a day. And listen, I'm going to be very transparent here. My wife had been saying to me year after year after year, Ralph, we need to start saving. Ralph, we need to start saving. And I would go buy that new iPhone and I'd go buy that new car. And it wasn't until I was about 47 years old that I really started to focus on saving for retirement. And now, listen, and this is a guy, I do this for a living, right? This is what I do. I understand this. And even me, it took me that long to get started. And Craig, what you say is so important. And we have to look at the long-term effects of these short-term decisions, which leads me actually to the next thing I want to talk about. And that is the whole idea of stewardship. And I think that this is one of the ways that we can really help recast this and refocus this. And I hope will help people combat this constant battle with impulse spending and all of that sort of thing. And that's, we got to see ourselves as managers. And a lot of people say, wait a minute, Ralph, I work hard for what I have. And I'm going to drop a truth bomb that I drop on the show. And Craig, I don't know if you've ever heard me say it, but guess what? It's not yours.
Right.
And I think that's ultimately where we have to get to, is a place of realizing, and look, if you don't subscribe to Ralph's position on that, that's fine. You don't have to listen to me. That's fine. I'm saying to you, and Craig, you don't have to be a Christian to think like this. What I'm saying to you is, if you have a philosophy, and I know you study a bunch of different types of religious beliefs and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately it's all about that center core of managing something that you've been given. And I don't know about you, but when I borrow, a great example, if I borrow a tool from the neighbor, right? Let's say I have a branch goes down in my backyard. Now I've got a bunch of chainsaws because I have a farm. You probably have the same thing. But let's just say I didn't, right? I'm going to go borrow the neighbor's chainsaw. I'm going to treat that chainsaw like it's gold, right? Because it's not mine. Well, if you have that same mindset with your finances, and you realize that your job is not to own it, it's to steward it, it's to do the right things with it, then I think you can find that balance, and you can enjoy those blessings that God is giving all of us, because he is richly blessing us. We've said this before on the show. If you're listening to this show right now, you are blessed. You're living in a place of abundance. And I don't care whether you live in paycheck to paycheck. If you have an internet or you're listening to this show, you are living in abundance right at this moment. And guess what? My opinion is that was given to you by God, and you have an obligation to steward that. Now, I got a little bit on a tangent, so I apologize about that. But I think it's so important, Craig.
But you're right. And even the Stoics have a saying, something along the lines of, everything we have is on loan from fate. You know, it's the same idea. I want to bring up one quick thing, though. We're making this sound like it's big and hard. I know we've said that it isn't multiple times, but a lot of the way we're talking about this makes it sound like you've got to make all these changes. You have to make one change at a time. I used to play volleyball, recreational volleyball. We were pretty good. And I can remember in a couple of championship games, we'd get down. And I would say, look, I know we're down 8 points or whatever. We've just got to win this next point, 1 point at a time. That's all. Forget about those other 7. We just want to win this one. And you'd be amazed at how many times we won those matches, just 1 point at a time. So just try to do one thing tomorrow. Make one financial decision that's a little bit better. It might be starting to track what you're spending your money on. It might be starting on a budget in some other way. It might be passing up on the candy bar, but just one thing at a time. I'm going to lay a little bit more philosophy on you. Aristotle said we are what we repeatedly do. And if you start making a little positive financial decision, and then another one, and then another one, and you do that repeatedly, over time, you won't just have a habit of financial prudence. You will be a person who is financially prudent. It'll just be part of who you are. But it's one little tiny thing at a time.
You're absolutely right, Craig. And that's why I want to just end today. And we're not quite ready to end, but start moving in that direction. And these are some real simple things that you can do. Just start tracking your expenses. Just track where you're spending your money. And like you said, little things. Just track your expenses so you have some awareness. And then once you do that, take a look at it. Where does my money go? You know, am I being intentional with what I'm going to do? And does it reflect my priorities? Because one of the things that you've got to have, and I'm going to talk about that on the show coming up next week, and you really walked into where I'm going with the show on a daily basis, Craig. And what I realized over the past couple of weeks is that everybody needs just one thing they can work on per day. And that's really where I'm taking this show. The show now on a daily basis, you can check it out at askralph.com, is just one thing. What is one thing I can do to change the dynamic? Because the truth is, you can feel so overwhelmed in this because it's all around. You've got the credit card bill sitting in front of you. Maybe you've got the collectors calling. Maybe you've got the eviction letters, or you've got all those things around you. And that can seem daunting. That can seem overwhelming. But what is one thing that I can do today? What is one? Because the thing is, like you said, Craig, so eloquently, you add that one thing, and then the next day you add another thing, and then you add another thing. That momentum is huge, and it can really start to build that momentum in a positive direction to where this doesn't seem so insurmountable. You know, it's just like when you walk out the door, like I take a walk every morning, or I do the elliptical every morning. Well, guess what? It starts with the first step. And that's what I want to encourage people to do today, is take that first step. Maybe the first step for you is awareness. You know, you start to look at, okay, where's my money really going? Because I think it'd be eye-opening to you. And yes, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. It's going to make you feel like, oh boy, I didn't realize this. But there's value in that awareness. And then once you build that awareness, maybe you take that step to that, and maybe we don't even use the word budget, to that intentionality. We start to think about, where do I want to be in a week? Where do I want to be? Because it could be as simple as, listen, by Friday, I don't want to be broke. Yep. I mean, how many people get to Thursday night? I remember when I was a young guy, I got to Thursday night, man, I couldn't wait for that check for Friday morning to hit direct deposit because I wasn't sure how I was eating.
Right.
And as I'm saying, like, we can make this seem overwhelming, but if we make individual decisions on a daily basis to skip that candy bar or to brown bag it, and it doesn't have to be complete restriction, because you didn't hear me or Craig say one time today to don't live your life. Right. Not one time did we say that. We just said be intentional about it. Be aware of it, because ultimately it's your choice. You can make those decisions.
That's right. It's under your control.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to. And I want to encourage everybody, because listen, this is a journey. And that's the thing I want you to hear today. This is a journey. There is no instant fix. If you thought you were going to come in and listen to me today, and I say this on my daily show every day, if that's what you're looking for, keep in the old radio, turn the dial, because I'm not going to give you that. I don't have that instant fix. I just don't. But I do have a daily little bit of nugget, a little kernel that will help you build that progress. Because here's the thing, and Craig, and I'm sure the Stoics believe this, it's not about perfection.
No.
Because guess what? You're never going to reach that level of perfection, ever. Hear me on that. Like, I was very strong about the prosperity thing. Well, guess what? You're never going to reach perfection, but you can reach progress. And that progress is day in and day out. And the other thing, and Craig has said this so many times, have grace for yourself. Because guess what? You're going to make mistakes.
Right.
You know, I went to college for accounting, and guess what? I make financial mistakes. And you know, it's hard for me to admit, because if people listen, I was like, right now, oh, Ralph, you're giving me advice and you're the one who makes mistakes. Yes, guess what? I make mistakes.
That's how you know what advice to give.
Absolutely right, because the truth is, if I hadn't made those mistakes, I wouldn't be able to say to you, here's how to get out of those mistakes. But it takes having grace for yourself. It takes that persistence. It's that daily decision. Hey, listen, if you blew yesterday, that's fine. Put your head on the pillow, get up the next morning and say, today I'm going to make this one change. And the thing I'm going to throw into that is just say that, you know, seek God's wisdom for that. Say to God, listen, I'm failing at this, God. I don't know how to do this. And realize that freedom is possible. That's the thing. I want you to hear that today. There is freedom. Nothing that we talked about today is insurmountable. You can achieve that freedom, and you can find that peace. It just means you're going to have to work towards it. It's not going to fall into your lap. You've got to do something to get there. Craig, I want to give you a couple minutes to kind of encapsulate your thoughts today.
No, I think that's exactly right. If you're feeling stressed and shackled by your financial situation, the number one thing you can do to start to feel better is to take some positive action. Just do something. Don't even spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what should I do first? Doesn't matter. Do something. You know, pick one of the techniques from all the episodes you've got, Ralph, or something we've talked about today, and just do something. And I guarantee you'll feel better about that. And then do something else, and then do something else. I mean, really, don't treat this as, you know, I've got to go a million miles. You don't. You just have to take one step. I know it's a cliche, but, you know, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and that is just so true. So that's it. Just do something. Do something. That's all.
Absolutely. And celebrate those things. When you save $5 this week, I mean, oh, big deal, $5. No, that's a big deal. If you've never saved, if you've never gotten to the part at the end of the week where you have margin and you have $5 in margin, that's an accomplishment.
But don't go out and save by spending $10.
Well, I agree with that statement.
Or go out and celebrate, rather. Yeah. No, but you're right. I mean, we really do feed our little, I know I've said dopamine a bunch today. That's kind of we were Pee Wee Herman, we'd have that as the word of the day. But, That little bit of pleasure that you get from making a positive step is huge. It really is a self-reinforcing cycle. And so just do that. Just do one thing, that's all.
I agree. And Craig, I just want to thank you again for joining me this week, man. It has been a fantastic discussion. And if you're listening, you probably think, man, they talk about the same things. Well, we're trying to build that foundation. And once we build that foundation, then we'll be able to talk about other things. But I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to encourage you to bring friends to this live show. We do it every Monday. We appreciate you being part of the community. And excuse me. Yeah, thank you. See, I got tax season on the brain, Craig. I'm telling you, it's like we talk about margin. Today is my margin day. It's like Mark put something in a chat that him and I are in, and he said, today is tax liberation day. I'm like, yeah, you're not kidding. And it's just funny, and not to take a big sidetrack, but it's funny how just like the mental clouds just change. But anyway, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And like I said, this week I got some really exciting news. We're launching a new series, okay? And that's going to be the daily show. It's going to be called The Joy of Living Below Your Means. And I really think there's going to be value there because it's going to be a one-day thing. Here's how can we find joy in living below our means. You can find more resources by going to AskRalph.com. So God bless you. Stay financially savvy. And as Craig and I encourage you, take that first step towards financial freedom. Do it today. We really encourage you because you can do it.
Thank you for joining us on the Ask Ralph Show. And with a simple click to subscribe, we'll invite you back to our next episode. And remember, financial issues don't have to be complicated. Just ask Ralph. The information contained in this episode of Ask Ralph is based on data available as of the date of its release. Saggio Accounting Plus and Ask Ralph Media, Inc. is under no obligation to update this content if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances, and any information provided is not to be considered as financial, tax, or legal advice. Please consult your tax advisor or attorney before acting on any material covered.